time, grief we go, gotta learn to let it go.
Welcome to Wake the F Up podcast, where we talk about living consciously and helping people uncover their essential selves so that they can stop sleepwalking through life. Welcome back to Wake the F Up podcast, where we dive into the messy, beautiful work of healing loss through self-love to create beautiful transformations from the shattering. I'm your host, Alix, and as always, I'm so grateful you're here with us today. Our guest today is someone whose work and story are deeply aligned with the mission of this podcast. Laura Walton is a licensed mental health therapist, a yoga instructor, author, grief coach, and grief expert. Laura's journey, both personally and professionally, has been shaped by profound loss and the search for healing. Today, she's here to share her wisdom about navigating grief and trauma and the tools she's found most effective for fostering emotional health. Welcome, Laura. We're so excited to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell the listeners, where are you coming from today?
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh my gosh, so you may have skipped this snowstorm that was like knocking everyone out.
Probably skipped it, but it's very cold here still.
It does get cold there. Dry cold can be very, very cold. Well, welcome.
Yeah.
We are so excited to have you. And I thought maybe we'd start a little bit about just listening to your journey and your story. Your background sounds so rich, and I'm just excited for you to share with the listeners everything you've walked through and how you've taken such maybe difficult portions of your life and created this meaningful journey for others to kind of go with you on through healing. And so if you want to tell the listeners maybe just a little bit about your journey and what your current work is focused on and kind of how you got to be where you are today.
Okay, I feel like that's a big story, but I'll try to keep it bite-sized. Well, when I was a kid, I never had, some kids are like, I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up, or I'm going to be this when I grow up, or whatever. And I never had the thing that I was going to be when I grew up. And so it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s, due to life things that happened, that sort of dictated what I was going to be when I grew up. But essentially, when I was 21, my dad committed suicide. And then when I was 26, the person who was I don't even, still to this day, don't even know what title to give him, because he was my best friend in the whole world. He was my on again, off again boyfriend. At the time of his death, we weren't technically together. So in some ways, it feels weird calling him my boyfriend, but he was also, he was my person.
Yeah.
And we were just young and stupid. But he died when I was 26 of a drug overdose. And that death was harder for me than my dad's death was, because of the relationship that we had. And that death just kind of ripped my world apart. I was young, I was mid-20s. I found myself just all of a sudden navigating this world that I wasn't prepared for, I didn't ask for. And I remember even at the time, in hindsight, I can see how kind of clueless I was as a 20-something, but at the time, I felt like what I was finding out there in terms of support for what I was going through sucked.
Yeah.
And it felt weird to me, because I was like, but everybody dies. So the fact that what we have to offer people who are grieving is so terrible and minimal, that just seems weird to me. And even in the very early days of my grief, I remember having this sense that it would kind of become my mission in a way to do better, to provide other people with better than what I found. I don't know, I think it was about 5 years after his death or so, I started looking into grad schools and applying to grad school. And I ended up going to grad school to become a therapist. And actually, rewind before that, I had been practicing yoga for a couple years before his death, but I also, before I went to grad school, started exploring different yoga teacher trainings and learning a lot about yoga, because I found that to be a very helpful thing for my grief. Anyway, went to grad school, became a therapist. I've worked for the past over 10 years as a therapist now. And now I'm at the point where, based off of my experiences, based off of what I've heard from my clients over the past decade or so who are grieving, hearing all the stuff that's still kind of missing in terms of support, in ways we support people who are grieving, people who are dying even. I've stepped a little bit away from the therapy field and am building this other business that's really focusing on, separate from therapy, supporting people in their grief and in their death.
It's really powerful. And I think a lot of what you said is so true as a griever. Just a little background, I lost my first husband to a long battle with cancer, and I'm remarried to actually a widower who lost his wife to a sudden traumatic brain aneurysm. And so we are raising now 6 children. We just had our first baby together, but 5 blended children who've all lost a parent. So we're just so much grief in my house all the time, and we're always processing it individually and collectively. And it's interesting when you think about, especially I was thinking my mother, her brother committed suicide, and I've actually watched how that kind of a death shaped my mother and her family in general. And it's interesting when it's a little bit of a taboo death, let's call it. I don't even know when we say taboo. That's kind of a weird way. There's not really good language, honestly. Even like what you're saying, there's not tools, there's not language, there's not words always for partnerships who are in loss. Like that's the thing. The world wants us to define everything and label it, right? And it's not necessarily to be labeled. And those are really what I imagine for you and for my mom is challenging even more, because just general death is really, really hard, and people want you to be in these boxes. And then when you have a death that doesn't make sense, or there's not a really reason why, or there's all this unresolved emotionality surrounding it, it becomes really, really, really hard. And it's almost like you're hiding in your grief. And I was wondering, sometimes as a widow, it feels like that too, right? Like there's the honoring, and then there's the anger and what feels like abandonment, especially if you have children and all of the responsibilities of the family you built that you're carrying alone. It's like you have to hide sometimes the harder parts of your grief from society. And you can only share those with someone who's an expert or someone who's maybe walked the path. And I was wondering if you felt that way when the second death came on. Was it more of a channeling? Because I felt that myself, and like sometimes other people's death are a more acceptable place to grieve than the suicide per se, or like, a friend dies. I'm like, I almost grieve harder in outside places than in my own grieving journey.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I don't know if you
It
feel that way.
does. And I think that absolutely happens for a lot of people. Like in some ways that gives permission for the grief, that for whatever reason, there could be a million of them, but whatever reason, the person didn't feel that permission before. So yeah, that makes sense. Interestingly, though, that wasn't necessarily my experience. Partly maybe I'll just call him my boyfriend. He died of a drug overdose, which is also a stigmatized death. So yeah, I had these 2 hugely stigmatized deaths that were front and center for me. But I did notice, even if I just said it, said if somebody asked how did they die or whatever, and I just said it, like, in a lot of people notice this, like, oh, and they just kind of stop talking, like I don't know what to say,
backing out.
Yeah.
Which is really challenging, right? Because you're not able to be like even in the story of the grief, even in the onset of the loss, like you can't even get into it because people don't even know how to like be around it, which is so challenging to heal from that for you, I imagine.
They don't know how to be around it, or they have their own judgments about it, or they've, you hear this often with suicide, like you just say the word suicide and people are like, oh, that's so selfish, or, some sort of just snap judgment about the situation without, there's a million factors, right? Without knowing anything, just having this very quick assumption about what that means. And that can be, that can just feel really hurtful and isolating to the person who is
so
grieving.
So lonely. And I imagine one of the things about grief, and I'm wondering how you might put this into practice with your coaching and in your personal practice. I love that you're saying that you're evolving into the coaching realm. It's really cool for the listeners to hear, the variety that can happen with your professionals in healing modalities, especially in grief. Like, I always find that I needed my grief therapist so much. I mean, really for 10 years, I've been working with her on the PTSD and certain parts of like getting out the trauma and looking at the deeper parts of maybe what was in my inner psyche. But I really need somatics and yoga and certain resiliency practices and coaching in the rebuild, because I need a lot more than just to continue to talk about the onset, the sadness, and the past. I need to move forward and figure out how to integrate all of that with the now person I want to become. So talk to me a little bit about, the difference between maybe your therapy clients as a therapist and then what you're doing on your website, and in your coaching work.
Well, I've loved working as a therapist with grief, but I've also felt constrained in a lot of ways. It's a licensed profession, so there's a lot of rules and regulations that need to be followed. And not that I'm, like trying to break all the rules here, but sometimes it can just feel like you're very much in a box. And I feel like I've outgrown that box a bit, and that has been a contributing factor to the pulling away from that a bit. But they can also, as you're saying, they can be different experiences. Like with the therapy, it can be, I mean, it can look like a lot of things, but it's not always like, I kind of think about it as like the nitty gritty, like real life stuff,
Yeah.
So, okay,
Right.
my world has just blown up. So how do I manage grocery shopping, or how do I do, any of the things that are just a part of our everyday lives? How do I talk to my children? How do I do, all of these things that are maybe more logistical things are also super important and super hard to navigate when you're grieving.
So true.
And often if those things aren't taken care of, you don't even have the capacity to do any therapy, because we need to eat dinner. you know
No, and the basics
so
can become so hard. They can become so hard when you're
yeah,
fatigued, and especially, I felt like that for sure, like on a caregiving journey that led to a death. It was like, almost like my nervous system was depleted before we even got to what was the funeral. And then after the aftermath, it's like, shit, how do you put your pants on in the morning is challenging.
yeah.
And so things like yoga and things that feel good in your nervous system are so vital. And I think
Mhm.
people who are doing different modalities like that to assist with grieving is so helpful, because you have to find things that replenish, and that self-love and self-care is crucial. Really, really hard to just, grocery shop, cook dinner, and put one foot in front of the
Yeah.
other for sure in the beginning. So talk to me about your grief, like your grief journey. So when you were, I guess we'll focus in maybe on the second loss, since that seemed to be the one where you really maybe were shattered all wide open, and I'm sure re-grieving your father as well. How did you find a way to kind of like put one foot in front of the other? Were there some tools or some things that you practice even now that sounds like yoga
Yeah.
was one of them that you find are really helpful in the grieving process?
I tried all the things, it's been like 18 years now, but over 18 years, I've tried a lot of things. Um, but still, I would say that the one thing that was the most helpful to me was my yoga practice. And I want to say, when I say yoga, oftentimes people just think of the physical practice of yoga, but there's so much more to a yoga practice. Do you actually have any experience with yoga?
I do. I actually, so my main work has been, I owned and operated a Pilates and yoga studio in New Orleans. And so, while my professional side of the work in that business was actually Pilates and my partner did all the yoga, man, I didn't want to become a yoga professional because I didn't want to work it in my brain. I wanted to continue to use it as a healing modality. And so the philosophy of yoga, definitely the chakras. I find meditation, to be one of the most powerful things that's, I struggle to get there, but the more that I practice yoga and all the legs and arms of that, the more that I find it connects with, I think, actually the philosophy of life. And I find myself to be more in aligned with Eastern philosophy every day. So yeah, huge fan of yoga, huge
Yeah.
fan.
So that's
Well,
the physical practice of yoga was great for me, being able to move through my body, being able to be in my body and move through the way that the grief was manifesting physically was great. But even more than that, I would say would be the other limbs of yoga, the philosophical practices of it that taught me how to be with something really, really uncomfortable.
well, and that's so interesting too, because if you look at Buddhism in general, which is not necessarily yoga, but similar mindset and philosophy, is that life is suffering, and that sounds like such a negative perspective. But yogis all over the world will say that same. It's like we can't escape this life without suffering, and I think it's really important as professionals in leading people on grief, and both of us who are, grief is not something you're going to escape. It's something that has to be integrated in your life. And I had a really cool Reiki practitioner yogi friend of mine who I took yoga classes and Reiki from, who told me this beautiful grief metaphor that was essentially like grief becomes sort of like a blender within inside of yourself, and you take these like really rough chunks of pain and suffering, and you are the blender, and you have to just keep working that circular motion to kind of grind it all down until it integrates and becomes a part of you, essentially. Like you become like the smoothie is your grief inside of yourself and in your emotionality. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor because it's true. We are not going to escape this life without love and suffering sitting kind of together all the time. And so it's like the beauty and the pain are besties holding hands, and that's what grief feels like, at least to me, and I imagine to you as well, as you walk people on their journey.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
well, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about, your grief and sort of the uncomfortable nature of being a griever, and how that's helped you maybe in your practice and now your platform of coaching. It's so interesting because I think all of us, no matter what kind of loss we've experienced, have this stigma, as you said, and it's sort of like the scarlet letter or the black veil that everybody talks about. Even the word widow and widower, it's like all these negative connotations around grieving. And I was wondering, how did you handle that? And do you have some advice to some listeners out there who might be working out of a stigmatized loss, and how you were able to process that?
As far as the stigma, I remember telling somebody once who was actually a doctor, but telling my doctor at the time how he had died a drug overdose, and her first response was, "Oh, were you doing the heroin too?" And I was like, "Really? That's your first response there?" And it just, I don't know. That one shook me, but gaining this understanding, I think, in just navigating the world of grief, seeing and experiencing responses like that over and over and over and over again in my earlier days of grief showed me that this just makes people uncomfortable. Like this isn't,
Yeah,
it's not, this isn't me. This isn't about me. This isn't even about whether it was my dad or Bo, the one who died. This isn't about them either. This is this person's uncomfort or discomfort, I should say, with the topic at hand. They have to immediately like judge it. So I think just in my experiencing that, unfortunately experiencing it a lot, but then seeing it happen enough that I was like, okay, I'm just going to accept that this is how we are. This is how people are. It sucks, but this is how we are. And that actually ties hand in hand with the yoga practice of just being able to sit with something that feels
right.
uncomfortable and not fall down the rabbit hole of my own story that I'm creating about that. Just being able to sit with that and let it be what it is. That eventually, I think, allowed me just to accept the fact that there are stigmatized deaths. Death itself is even sometimes stigmatized. Like we don't talk about that. And then there are
For
even
sure.
greater levels of stigma depending on how the death happened. And that is the reality. And if I try to fight that, there's a quote I love: if you try to fight reality, you'll lose. And so if I
Wow.
try to fight that, I'm going to make things harder for myself.
That's
Let
actually
it,
a really beautiful piece of advice, because I do feel like Maybe it's just the pitta in me, as the yogis would say. I'm a bit fiery, Irish by
Mm.
nature, and I think that a lot of times I would feel in the early days, probably pre really doing my work, um, I felt like a lot of the loss or the way that people place their opinions on how I should be processing the loss or even who I was becoming, what I was choosing for myself post loss was so unfair. And it almost made me angry and indignant to that I deserved the life that I was living or the choice and freedom to be whatever I needed to be to heal myself and my children. And it's so interesting that you said that, like 10 years later, right? 5 years later, I'm sitting thinking, the most important thing I'm doing in therapy and in somatic work right now is bearing witness to hard emotions and not trying to overwork them, not trying to press them away, not trying to even make a career out of it, like or make it to mean something and be something positive for others. Even though I am doing that, it's allow them to be these emotions to be witnessed because I think you're right. I think sometimes grief needs to be witnessed. It needs to be
Mhm.
seen, and it's really hard, right?
I would maybe even say that's all it needs is just to be
Y
witnessed.
yeah,
Yeah.
you might be right. You might be right. I might be the overworker of all the things constantly, but I do find that there's such a shortage of resources as I think you're in the same boat as me, that it's like you almost just have this desire to create a community that we didn't necessarily have. You know what I mean? It's just
Yeah.
so freaking hard. And when you are a griever, people find you in their grief. They'll be like, I heard you lost your dad to suicide. Tell me I'm going through this. It's like people will refer these people to you, and it's like whether you want to be the expert of it or not, you kind of become this communal expert, whether you're doing the work or not. Do you find that too? Did that happen before you even became a therapist?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it did. If somebody knows somebody who died and they're like, "Oh, you should talk to her. She's been through that." And not that I don't wanna do that because obviously I do, that's what I've created my life, but there also it feels like there's there's something really sad in that, I think too. If I went to my best friend and was, you know, really upset because somebody died and it's not my best friend's fault. I think it's more like our society's avoidance of this topic fault. Like my best friend can't handle that for whatever reason. She's like, "Oh, you need therapy. Go to this therapist over here." Or, "Oh, you need to talk to this somebody." We direct people maybe to somebody they don't even know, um, to go talk to them because they can help you. Of course, there are some people who are better equipped or better trained to help, but also that means we can't share those things, those experiences with the people who are closest to us because they don't have the capacity to hold that. Does that make
Did
sense?
you It does make sense. Did you lose a lot of people close to you in the grieving process that were unable to hold space for your emotionality and your grief?
I don't know that in the long term I lost a lot of people, but I think for a period of time,
Yeah.
I was just I isolated myself from people because I didn't feel seen, held, supported in my grief. I felt like I was a problem. I felt like, a couple weeks or month had passed and everybody else was over it and they were ready for me to be over it
Right.
too, but of course I wasn't. So I just kind of isolated myself. Um, it didn't There were probably a few relationships that were ultimately lost in that, but in the long term, no. But that does
That's
happen.
good.
I mean, we do lose you lose people and the most random people will show up in your life.
Right. Right. I had a griever one time, a widow that she had lost her husband prior to me losing my husband, and she had said that to me. She drew this like diagram. She was also a therapist, and she, very similar to you, took the loss, went to grad school, became a therapist, and created an entire grief center. Mary Kay Rodriguez is her name. She's remarried, but professionally goes by Mary Kay Rodriguez. She is amazing. But she told me like your inner circles, like, so like you take your circle of who's your support system now, and then like random people when you're in this grieving journey will replace some of your very closest friends, and like your circles will just keep shifting. And it didn't make sense to me at the time, but I heard her when she said that, and I watched it unfold, and it was a bit devastating to some degree that people who I felt had a great emotional capacity were unable to walk the journey with me to some degree.
Yeah.
I will say this though, I think the shattering for me to take more blame, take more ownership of it, is I think I was not the same after that. I think that I was inherently a people pleaser, inherently a codependent person based on my mom actually suffers deeply from depression. So I grew up in I'm very understanding of mental health and how that suffering and depression can be really, really challenging. And my mom's family has a long history of bad depression. And I think it shaped a lot of my people pleasing and wanting to fix things. And so after that long, you know, caregiving journey, and then the death, and then my children grieving and myself grieving, my capacity was below zero to do anything for anyone else. And so isolation was a huge deal for me. I mean, I needed it to actually heal. And I had a few estranged family member relationships that were such a struggle, and grief in itself. But I also found, like, I'm not sure if you felt that way, but in the isolation, I had to go inside. I had to own this loss and own who I was going to be. And I don't think I could be that same person ever again. I know that. Like, I'm such a different person to now. There's essence of my old self, but a
Yeah.
lot shifted for me. Did you feel that for you? Like, did you
Oh,
change
yeah.
completely? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, really, for anybody who's gone through experiencing the death of, it doesn't matter who the person is, but somebody who you love, that on a fundamental level changes you. Like,
Yeah.
that you will not, for many reasons. If it's the first death, you've never experienced death before. Up until then, death only happens to other people, right? But once
Right.
once you experience that, the whole world that you live in shifts. You will not be the same person.
I think your friends, they miss the you that was before. They don't know how to just, as you say, what the yogis would do, sit with the difficulty and just allow it to be. And I think that's like such a big piece of advice I often give to friends who seek me out, is like, get prepared that your friend is no longer, right? And I don't know how long that may be permanent, and it may be temporary, as they navigate their grief and loss, but like, you need to be prepared that they can't even drink coffee the same way, because everything changes in their world in that grief moment, right? We get up, we can't really brush our hair the same way. The person that we used to depend on is gone, and all these losses change just our daily routines, and people don't really are not aware of that if they haven't been through a loss. They think it's just the loss of the one person and that sadness, but it's really daily life that changes shape, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. As you said, everything changes, and
Everything.
that, yeah, and if your friends or your family haven't experienced a death before, they don't get that, and so they expect, maybe after a month or so, we expect the old you to come back, and that old you has also died.
Right,
And
that's what
it's
I
not,
say a lot too.
yeah,
It's like we die right there at that moment that your loved one dies, and if you keep trying to be the old you that everyone needs you to be, and even maybe you are grieving, wishing you could be,
yeah,
you're going to increase your suffering, tenfold, because it's not possible anymore. It's not possible. It's too big of a loss for you to stay the same. And that reshaping, reframing is, I think, we have to integrate the love and the loss, and figure out who we want to become moving forward. And I was wondering if you could talk a
mhm,
little bit about your platform. I myself kind of want to jump on there. That your widows platform, it's pretty rare to have a space for widows to go and heal. So I constantly was referred into like grieving spaces, which, there's different kinds of loss, of course, and I think all loss has a lot of ribbons of similarity and truths. But I do think being a widow can be really challenging, because if you're young too, like, to get back out there, and what the hell do you do now? Like, now, do you stay single forever with these young children? Do you get back out there? Like, there's so many stigmas in that. And I know you lost your boyfriend, we're just going to call him the love of your life, right? Like it doesn't matter what your titles were. How did you recover? How did you know how to put yourself back together? And when did you try again to like get yourself back out there? It's a secret topic no one will talk about, and I get more DMs and private messages about dating again because people are scared to
Yeah.
death to say it out loud. It's so sad.
Yeah. I mean, there's no right time to start dating again. I heard this saying once, and this could be about dating or removing their clothes from the closet. This could be about anything. But if the
Yeah.
thought of doing it makes you want to throw up, then now's not the right time. And there's no rush, and you don't need to do it right now. So I kind of like that as a very loose guideline as to when to start dating again, if ever. If you want to throw up, don't do it. Not yet.
I know. That's a great piece of advice because I think if you listen to it's somatics, right? If you listen to your embodiment and if your body is like, oh,
Yeah.
resisting, your body knows well before your brain when you're ready for things to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is the taboo topic, I think, is within the context of partner.
I actually was today. I happened to be so lucky that I have a lot of widows in my circle, and I had a friend of mine who we were friends first, and she lost her husband to ALS secondary, and we were talking about dating again, and she's 2 years out and kind of like unsure of like how to even consider. And I told her like I remember when I met David, we finally like met. It was COVID. It was such a weird time in general. Everyone was like masked up. Restaurants were closed. The city of New Orleans was shut down, and we met like we had to meet at a hotel, which is so weird, right? So like how awkward did that date go where I was like not ready, like even to be on a date, even to consider a date. My nervous system told me to go, but I was like, now we're going into a hotel room because that was legitimately the only place you could meet. And so when we met, we like had a table with food in a room, but it was so awkward. And I even remember the first time that we kissed. I remember that I went in to kiss him and he went in to kiss me, and it was though we were kissing our dead spouses. Like, you know what I mean? Because even your kiss is like a pattern and it's a routine and it's you kind of have a unknowing. And so I told her, I was like, look, the first time you kiss a new person, it will be a moment of grief, as will a lot of the things that when you experience new love, will be this excitement sitting next to sort of the sadness that like you can't go in and kiss your dead husband. He's not there anymore. And this is new lips, new person, new everything. And you have to, David always says, he said that night, like, we really need to get our people who died out of this room so that we can have a real chance at love. And I was like, man, that's a true statement. Talk to me a little bit about like either your widows, if you aren't dating yourself, or have you experienced the difficulties of putting yourself back out there?
Yes, of course. And I actually got a tattoo of his name on my wrist, like 3 days after he died, because I wasn't thinking clearly. But I actually I joke about that, but I actually do appreciate it, and like the style of it, I would maybe do differently if I could, but I appreciate having it now because it reminds me very much what that place was like 3 days after he died. A place where I'm like, fuck it, I can put a tattoo on my body. Who cares? Like just like a place that you're not typically in that place. So anyway, I have this visible tattoo on my body. So as I was, whenever it was that I did start dating again, that was something that people could see and would pretty soon into that relationship ask about it. And so pretty soon into the relationship, then I had to share what that was, which was actually probably a good thing because I remember a friend of mine when I got the tattoo, she said, at that point it was too late, but are you sure? Because that's tattooed on your body forever. And like, it doesn't matter because this experience is tattooed on my heart forever. And any future relationship I have, somebody's going to have to be okay with that or it's not going to work. There were people I dated and sometimes it didn't show right away, but they weren't okay with the fact that I had a tattoo, but also had this history of this person who had died and who would always be a part of my life. That wasn't okay with a lot of people.
It's hard. You have to find a person in the dating world, and hopefully, like if you're able to move forward and get married, if that's something that's in your heart, you have to have a person that's got a really strong capacity to understand love. And that can be really hard. There can be a lot of jealousy. Um, and even I will say this, we're as a double widowed team, like I had this interesting experience last night. It's never happened to me in grief. And I'm interested to like just say it out loud. And I'm like, I might sound like a total woo woo cray cray, but Carl has never come to me in my dreams. He died 5, almost 6 years ago. And last night, like of all nights, like who the hell knows, random Wednesday night, like nothing. I have an infant baby and it could just be sleep deprivation. Maybe I'm actually starting to see things. I'm not sure. I'm hallucinating potentially. But I had this like sleep wake moment between feeding, where I just had this overwhelming sense that he was in the room. I didn't see him. He wasn't necessarily like there speaking to me, but there was this overwhelming sense that he was like literally in a weird spot too, like on my nightstand, like near the baby's crib, and was like this peace came over me that was really like telling me, the energy was telling me that I'm doing well, like everything is great, and he's so happy for me. And it was so shocking. And I was thinking like the minute I told David this morning, so the minute I woke up, David brings me a coffee every morning. And I was like, oh my God, the craziest thing happened last night. And it was hilarious to see and witness him. And I've been on the other side of this, telling me this like uncontrollable, loving, peaceful dream state communication from the dead, and how he processed that, right? Like as the person who's here now, helping me raise our children, putting in all the hard work, it's like, can be really hard. Sometimes you're like, well, you wish they would fly down and like help you they discipline the children or deal with the really hard grief moment. You're like, fuck, I have to be the one that's like here holding them. Where our dead people get to be free of the suffering of this world. And it was interesting. I was thinking like, even now, we have to balance this. Like he was so grateful I had the moment. He loved me. He's here with me working this life now. And that yet there was always going to be this place in my heart that's Carl's, and in his heart that's Betsy, and that's his wife's name. So super interesting. I wondered if you have had any like drop-ins, or I don't normally talk about this, but like any spiritual awakenings or moments in yoga, especially Shavasana, can be a place where I feel like I can connect with something a little deeper than my physical self.
Mm-hmm. This is like my favorite topic these days because
I know.
I've had those experiences. And as 18 years have now passed, the way I've understood this is I still have a relationship with him, but it looks different. But it has evolved and it has built because of these experiences. One, in the, I don't know, we'll say 2 weeks or so after he died, there were just so many crazy, unexplainable things, coincidences that happened, but also things with like technology, like the lights going out everywhere, phones ringing, just all kinds of crazy things that shouldn't have happened. Happened. And the way that I made sense of those things, and again, some people will call me the crazy person because of it, but the way that I made sense of those things was that it was his energy that was around and making his presence known in some way. And I had an experience similar to what you're talking about, where I just knew he was there. I could just feel, I was driving, I could feel him sitting in the passenger seat there. And I was like, hey, looked over and said hi, but I got a sense of like what that felt like how I felt that in my body, and paid close attention to that. And as time has gone on, that's been something that has grown with me, and I can, it's different than just normal every day. If I'm just sitting here, like he's not around, that feels different than when I feel him around. So I can feel that, and it's been kind of an evolutionary relationship.
I think it's really important to practice interoception. That's such a polyvagal theory terminology that just means going inside, and yogis say it in a million different ways, and therapists teach you to do it as well. So like all of your practices that you're teaching are that, it's just sitting inside the self. And when you're doing what they call autonomic intimacy. So getting to know yourself at an intimate level as though you would practice with a partner outside of yourself, you really do know your own energy, and you start to understand like the difference between potentially an energy that comes in the room that feels like your past partner, and in whether your grief is heavy, and you can start to really feel the energy of yourself and those that you're co-regulating with and in a space with. And so it's really powerful. I think whether or not you have a belief that there's an afterlife, it's personal, and that's okay. But I also believe that it's so important to go inside, and that's really the path to healing, is sitting with what is true, right? Do you feel that way too?
Yeah. And that is the place from which your grief will evolve in whatever way it's going to evolve for you, whether that's processing the grief, whether that's developing or maintaining a connection with the person, whatever that is, like that can only happen by being able to be with it, to go inside and get curious about your grief.
Yeah, it's so cool that you talked about your tattoo. I actually have one as well. It's the number 9. And we had this like crazy, as you said, energetic series of 9s when Carl and I were together. And we were married on the 9th. Both of our children were born on the 9th. He died 9/9/19 at 9 p.m.
Whoa.
Um, so crazy. And then, I often look at this. I got the tattoo on the 9th month in the 9th hour of the day, and I think it was like 9 something. It was a series of 9s again. And this is crazy, but I was pregnant with Genevieve, my newest child that David and I had together this September. I had a really tough pregnancy. I almost died on the table, like crazy stuff happened. And she was born on 9/11. And my tattoo, as you can see, maybe not, it's like very glary right now. The sun is very bright where I am, but it's a 9 when it faces me.
Uh-huh.
And when it faces outwardly, it's an 11. So 9/11. Uh-huh.
That's crazy. Cool.
So crazy. And I was literally like, it dawned on me. I really was like kind of stressed because I had to have a C-section. It was like a lot of complications. I did not want her to be born. She almost came, like I almost went into labor on the 9th. And my body just kind of calmed down at midnight, made it through, and was born on the 11th. And it's so crazy. I often really think, and when I look at this tattoo, maybe you feel the same way. The evolution of it is, I now remind myself, keep going. There's a purpose. There's a lot of synchronicity and grief, and it is an evolution, and it never goes away. But the person that you can become, if you accept it and if you integrate it, and you do stuff like we're doing, which is stop making it a stigma for others. You hold space for grievers. You remind yourself that it is love, and that it is meant to be felt, and that none of us are escaping this world without death, including ourselves. And so that the sooner that we get comfortable with it, the more beauty you can have in your life, because it teaches you actually how to live. I mean, that is the juxtaposition of the opposite ends of it, the pain, right? The yogis talk about that suffering will teach you how to live. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I feels like that's the platform that you're holding. And I think it's really amazing. And to be honest, there's not that much out there, especially for widows. So all the widows out there, check out Laura's page, because I think I'm going to pop in there, because even though I am a studier, as I think you are too, like I want to know all the things to see if it will make me better. The truth is, at the end of the day, I need to sit with my sadness. I need to sit with my grief, and I need to be witness with other widows that it's hard. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And even maybe forever, as you said, this is a part of you and a part of your story forever. And so even as time passes, um, it still brings so much, I think, to the grief experience, and being able to share that with other people who have, I guess on both ends, other people who have and have not experienced that, but just being able to continue the conversation around it, in my experience, is hugely helpful and transformative.
It's been a really cool week. I had a guest on yesterday that owns a company that takes ashes and makes diamonds, and they use a year-long process to like tell the story of the person and create something special and meaningful, like similar to a tattoo that you can look down at every day, and you can pass on, after you pass away. So it's cool to think about, like, your interview is so similar but so different in the sense that, like, she was taking something internal and making it proudly external and telling the story so that we don't have to hide all this inside. And you're saying the same, but differently. Like, we really need to sit inside of our grief and watch and be witness to its evolution. And I was wondering, where are you today in your grief? Like, how have things changed for you? How has yoga helped you on your journey? And yeah, maybe just share a little bit about what it looks like 18 years later. We're still on a
Yeah.
platform healing and talking about it, right? So we know it's a forever thing, huh?
My yoga practice has overall taught me, as I was saying, like just the ability to, or the practice, because I'm not always perfect with it, but the practice of being able to sit with what is, whatever that happens to be. Closer to the time of his death, what is was the grief and the reality that he had died. And I learned how to sit with that, how to be with that. Now, of course, that still impacts me and is a part of my life, but there's other life things that happen that are hard. And my yoga practice has continued to teach me how to sit with what is, whatever that might be. But as far, this is interesting because I just had a very interesting experience with my grief recently, in December, because his birthday is in December. On that day, well, first of all, I woke up that day and maybe for the first time, the fact that it was his birthday wasn't the first thing on my mind the moment I woke up. That had been true for quite a while,
Yeah.
but I had been awake for a couple hours, and I was like, "Oh shit, today's the day." And to have that different experience was different.
Did you feel guilt behind that?
No, I was gonna say, like, I've worked with
Good.
many people who have talked about that being a fear, and younger me would have been horrified at that prospect,
Right.
that the idea that there will be a day where you're not first thing in the morning thinking it's his birthday or death day. Like, that would have been a terrible suggestion, because that would have suggested I'd forgotten or something.
Yeah.
Being in it, that
But
wasn't the reality.
but that's not the case, right? Being in it, you didn't forget about him. It just wasn't the heaviness that comes on a
Yeah.
holiday.
Yeah, it wasn't the case. I didn't feel terrible. I didn't feel guilty. I actually felt the opposite. I felt like, wow, this is cool.
That's great.
I also listened to a song that reminded me of him that he was obsessed with at the time. And this was such a crazy day because I was so like excited and like joyful, and was really in tune with this connection with him that I was talking about earlier, that I felt his
Mhm.
presence. And I was like, this is crazy and awe-inspiring that this is the relationship that I get to continue to have with him. Not that if I could go back in time and change what happened, I would, of course, but it's also awesome that this is what I have today. And so I had
Yeah.
this experience of grief that's the first time that grief has shown up for me
Joy.
in that way. But that was the opposite of maybe what we think about when we think about grief. We think about it as being this like heavy sadness, but this experience of grief was light and joyful and awe-inspiring. And so since this was only 2 months ago, so since then I've been really 1 month ago, I've been really kind of sitting with that in this maybe redefining, for myself at least, what grief is and what grief means and what our expectations are of grief.
Wow. Yeah, that's really beautiful and awe-inspiring. I had our wedding anniversary popped up in January. It was the very same. I woke up and I actually did forget that it was the day, almost the whole day. And then that evening, I had a sliver of guilt that I forgot. Um, and
Mhm.
we had attended a wedding, like, maybe a weekend after that, and I even sat in the wedding, but I sat in the wedding and felt like, I can't believe that I woke up and kind of forgot. Like, it wasn't the first thing that came to mind. I didn't beat myself up, even though the guilt kind of did come in a little bit. And when I sat at the wedding, I remember thinking, like, how beautiful that I'm here holding hands with my husband now, and that I was able to have the marriage that I had before. And you're right. And it was a big moment of joy for me that all these powerful love stories that I've been able to have and be a part of. And it is interesting. I've never thought of what you just said, which I need to chew on this for a good while, is redefining grief. through our own hearts. So like, it is a personal story. I wish it could be a societal norm that we could redefine grief. And maybe that's the job that you and I have signed up for. But personally speaking, like, what if subtly we redefine grief in our own, without anyone else's opinions, inside of our
Right.
hearts and inside of our lives, and we notice that it doesn't have to be always heavy, and it is hope to our listeners who might be in the early days, that right in the early days, it's a lot to put your pants on any holiday, especially a birthday, where the person should be alive and celebrating with you. But necessarily,
Right.
it won't always feel that way. And therapists always tell you that, but it's true. It won't always feel that way. The heaviness won't always be there. And it's hopeful.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I just appreciate you so much. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can find you, and kind of what you're passionate and working on your site? It's a beautiful, beautiful site, and I actually am going to hop in as a just a client. I always need a little resourcing.
Yeah. Yeah. So my website is
I
griefonpurpose.com.
love it.
And then the Instagram is grief period on period purpose. But lots of just resources and information available. I have courses, self-led courses, and journals that I've created just based off of my however many years of doing this, like the common questions and misunderstandings I see come up. All the courses and journals are tailored to answering those things. I'm working on writing a book right now that is about yoga
Yay.
and the application of yoga practice to grief. So that's in the works.
I
I should
love
probably tell.
that. And I'm obsessed with the lens that you brought today, because we've had a million yoga practitioners on here, of course, talking about grief and various forms of emotional healing. But I've never had anyone say directly sitting with what is, which I think is literally the message of the day, which is in every stage of grief and your grief journey evolving, you have to learn to sit with what is. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sitting with what is. Learning the
Yeah.
practice of doing has been probably the
Well,
number one life-changing practice I've ever learned.
I really appreciate that today. I am coming out of a little bit of postpartum blues, which I think is
Mhm.
normal postnatal, but it's interesting to get into like an unknowingly sadness that then pulls my grief a little bit. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think that I have to sit with what is, and I think I'm doing that, but like bringing some conscious awareness to that and making that a mantra is going to be
Yeah,
really helpful, I think, in the year for me, and I think to the listeners as well. So I am so grateful to you, and I can't wait to see your book and jump into your site and see if I can get a little widow community going. So thank you so much for your time today, and just sharing your heart. And it's a beautiful story, and I think the world needs more Laura for sure. I kind of want to be you when I grow up, as I said before we got on camera. I'm like, yeah, Wake Wellness is essentially very similar. We're doing the same thing, but instead of sitting with what is, we're working on loving the self, to work on the lens of grief, and maybe that is what is. I don't know.
yeah,
It's a very similar way of saying it, but I appreciate you, Laura, and everybody. Just look in the show notes. We're gonna have tons of resources to connect you to Laura and all of her resources, and get you to work with her one-on-one or in the group coaching platform. And she's got a lot of beautiful courses that I really wish I would have had my hands on in the early days of grief. So thank you so much. I
yeah.
appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was nice to meet you and work with you.
I know, you too. Okay, well, we will be talking to everyone soon. Thanks so much. Have a great day, and stay awake out there.
If you enjoyed this episode of Wake the F Up, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Wake community by downloading our app. Just search for The Wake Wellness in the Apple or Android App Store. And follow us on Instagram at The Wake Wellness. Thanks for listening.